Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rabia Chaudhry, and my pronouns are she, they. I will be one of the two moderators for today's panel on unpacking rape culture in an ableist world.
Hi, everyone. My name is April Campbell. My pronouns are she, her, and I will be the second moderator for this panel tonight. So before we begin this panel, I would just like to give the land acknowledgement. So Brock University is located in Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, and Haudenosaunee territory, and is also on land with a long history of Black presence, community building, and agitation for freedom. This territory is protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, which confirms the land as a living entity that requires care for the people who are responsible. The dish represents the territory, while the spoon represents the land, the wealth of the land. The absence of a knife within this treaty spoke to the need to maintain peace for the benefit of all. Importantly, all participants in the agreement had the responsibility to ensure that the dish would never be empty by taking care of the land and all of the living beings on it. Acknowledging territory serves to remind us of our positionality on stolen land. Additionally, it is a testament to the violent, lasting legacy of white settler colonialism that is intrinsically linked to the erasure of Indigenous people, ongoing systemic inequity, and the institutional oppression they continue to face. The Sexual Violence Prevention Committee is dedicated to combating the occurrence of sexual violence on campus, and it is important that we note the history of sexual violence is inextricably linked to settler colonialism. We must unpack that history as it is a tool of genocide. Bringing these histories into view substantiates the historical presence of Indigenous people while necessitating us to think critically about how this Canadian space operates through and by the marginalization of Indigenous bodies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, April. And before we begin to introduce our panelists, we would also like to thank Brock Student Justice Center, SJC, the Human Rights and Equity Office, HRE, and Packard's Sexual Violence Prevention Committee for funding and supporting this event. Tonight, we will be unpacking gender-based violence and ableism in our everyday lives. The content discussed may be triggering, so please make sure to take time to take care of yourself and reach out if you need support.
So our first panelist is Lydia Collins, Race, Disability, and HIV Prevention. Lydia Collins is an author and a sexual health educator based in Montreal, a great Black woman in January 2019, her second To Everyone We've Ever Been in September 2020, a free digital chapbook in transit in February 2021, and produced a collaborative video project with UNILEARNAL, Joy is Our Birthright, in October 2020. Lydia is a co-founder of the grassroots consent education group, Decolonize and Deconstruct, entered her role as at the African Unwavering Love for Writing and Communized Voices.
I apologize. It looks like we're having a little bit of some technical issues. Thank you so much, April, for introducing Lydia. Lydia, now if you would like to begin your presentation, that would be great.
Thank you so much, Rabia, and thank you, April, as well. Welcome to the world of Zoom. It's unpredictable, so totally understandable. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here. I feel like that's the most popular line of 2021. So hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to be part of this event and having this conversation with you. my interest, and I guess the focus of my work really focuses on HIV prevention and sexual violence prevention, and it all has kind of wrapped in under the context of ACB communities in Ontario, so African, Caribbean, and Black, for those of you who might not be familiar with those terms. So I'm just going to go ahead and dive in here. So to kind of reiterate some of what was mentioned in my bio about the work that I do, I work as the Learning and Development Specialist for a provincial HIV and AIDS organization that focuses specifically on HIV prevention and care for Black communities in Ontario. So at the core of our work is really intersectionality, understanding social determinants of health. Those are really the things that stand out most for what we do. And our kind of purpose is to remove and limit barriers to accessing sexual health and care for ACB people. So with that in mind, kind of going into some of the sexual health related work that I do, some of the first of that, as mentioned in my bio, was Decolonizing Deconstruct. And that was with a group of BIPOC students at Brock University during my undergrad. Some graduate students, some undergraduate students, led by a few professors, including Dr. Margot Francis, who is here. Hi, Margot. And Decolonizing Deconstruct really focused on providing inclusive consent education. So a group of us really came together and saw that consent campaigns on campus and kind of in the communities that we were living in were very surface level. They focused on yes means yes, no means no, but they weren't getting to that root of how anti-Blackness, how racism impacts our relationship to sexual violence and what that looks like, right? And that it is relevant and it is important to talk about, and that you can't have inclusive consent education without it being rooted in anti-racism. And so that was really the focus on that. And we talked a lot about agency and accountability and consent. So kind of looking at the HIV prevention work that I do alongside the sexual violence prevention work that I do, there's some common threads that I constantly see woven between the two over the few years that I've been doing this work. That is absolutely linked to and relevant to disability justice, and looking at the impacts of ability and disability on individuals' sexual health. So from my experience, the common thread that I've seen between race and disability and HIV prevention, or even just sexual health more broadly, is this assumption that it doesn't impact them, right? So that's one thing that comes up in a lot of the research around HIV and disability, is this idea that people are assumed to be desexual if they have a physical disability, and are not given the attention or the care that they need because they're kind of just pushed to the side, and it's thought that it doesn't impact them. And again, going right along with sexual violence prevention work that I've done, that lack of autonomy has also been one that's commonly stuck out. That again completely links back to folks being able to make informed decisions about their sexual health while living with physical disabilities. So having doctors decide that, oh no, you don't need to be on this because I'm assuming that you don't have sex, of course, shows that lack of autonomy, lack of agency for those folks. Another one that I've seen a lot is a lack of understanding that sexual health impacts everyone's overall health and wellness. So sometimes we think of sexual health and we think of sex, and we assume that there are certain people, certain bodies, certain ways that it looks to be involved and to be a sexually active being. And the reality is that sexual health, whether you're having sex or not, impacts everyone's health and wellness. And it's something that everyone has the right and deserves and should be able to have access to gain that information, that knowledge, and those resources around how to best take care of their sexual health. And then there's also, I find, this assumption that race, ability, and sexual health don't intersect, right? This idea that they have nothing to do with each other, when we know that that's not true. Through lived experience, through theory, through research, we know this to be true, that these three things absolutely go hand in hand, and that they impact people in various ways based on different, intersecting aspects of identity. And so again, talking a bit about some of the research that's done around HIV and disability. We know that people with disabilities are often overlooked in HIV prevention in regards to testing, in regards to treatment and programming, and just facing more barriers in regards to accessing services. We know that although research suggests that youth with physical disabilities are as sexual as youth without physical disabilities, we see that there is these assumptions from peers, educators, parents, other professionals, healthcare professionals, who are assuming that these folks are asexual or that they're lacking sexual interest, even when they say that they are interested and intend to live sexual lives. We also see that there's often an increased risk of poverty, severely limited access to education and healthcare, and that lack of information, again, and resources needed to facilitate safer sex. So when we talk about what does the facilitation of safer sex look like for people living with disabilities, and again, going back to the work I do in the context of working particularly with Black folks in HIV prevention, thinking about how to best support ACB people living with disabilities who are interested in learning more about sexual health and want to take care of their sexual health. So what are the tools needed in order to facilitate that? And in regards to some of the barriers, right? So some kind of more tangible examples of barriers, and less kind of just generalized ones that we know around people with disabilities having maybe less access to this information or to these resources. Some of the ways that we see this taking place is the fact that youth with disabilities are often excused from physical education classes. And for many of us, when we took sexual health education, it's usually taught in gym class. Youth with disabilities being 3 times more likely to be abused than youth without physical disabilities. So that being another method of transmission for HIV, for when we think about sexual violence and disability and HIV and the transmission of it. And then there's also this misperception that they have cognitive impairments that limit them to make any kind of informed or rational decisions around sex. So an example of this might be a doctor refusing to put someone on birth control, or provide them with condoms, or give them kind of information or also just physical tools to be able to engage in safer sex practices. And again, going hand in hand with that, is that assumption of being desexual, right? So being overlooked on dating apps, being overlooked in media, in life in general, in different areas around dating, sex, love, romance. We see people living with disabilities often being left out of these conversations, both in regards to just representation, but also the actual access to these things as well. And so what does overcoming some of these barriers look like? So while I was a strategy worker at Somerset West Community Health Center in Ottawa, I implemented something called the Ride to Test program. I was really interested, and still am really interested, in finding ways to implement more accessible ways of accessing testing. We do so much programming around get tested, telling people get tested, but then people ask how, right? How do I get tested? Where do I get tested? I don't drive. How am I supposed to go to get tested? My doctor won't refer me to get tested because he doesn't think that I'm at risk. So the Ride to Test program essentially is for ACB folks in Ottawa to have free transportation to and from their appointments at Somerset West, where we do, or they do, I don't work there anymore, where they do anonymous HIV testing. So we have a really awesome anonymous HIV tester there who, with just a touch of a finger prick, the poke of a, the touch of a finger prick, is you have your results, your HIV results within minutes. And you have on-site support, someone there to help you with resources regardless of the outcome of your status. So having that ability to have transportation to and from there was something that I noticed was really important for a lot of folks. HIV self-testing, for those of you who might have heard anything or be involved in the HIV or community health sector at all, know that HIV self-testing is kind of the big hype of this year. Just recently got approved in the past year in Canada, and it's something that in Ontario, we've been seeing more campaigns. The Get a Kit campaign rolling out to get more people to purchase HIV self-tests and have more conversations about them. And I think that with the self-tests, it really is going to be a game changer for people living with disabilities in regards to taking back the agency and taking care of their sexual health without having to rely on some people who might have systemic bias and prejudices that they have to face on a regular basis. So the HIV self-test is a really amazing way to have an HIV test literally brought to your door and be able to prick yourself and do it yourself and be able to know your results and get the care that you need, regardless of your status. And then again, rapid anonymous HIV testing is something that some community health centers and other organizations do, which is again, just a finger prick of blood, and within minutes, you know your status. And a few other ones are, more practical in regards to sex and acts of sex itself, is sharing accessible sex toys and aids for people with physical disabilities, right? So really considering people living with disabilities when we're talking about sex, when we're talking about sex practices. We already hear so much about methods of protection for safer sex. And we know that that's very much, that rhetoric is dominated by kind of heteronormative understandings of what sex looks like. So we hear use a condom, go on birth control, that's about it. And for many of us who might be queer, or for folks who might be differently abled, that might be not necessarily the only thing that we need, right? So bringing up conversations around different kinds of sex toys that are accessible for different people, talking about internal condoms, talking about lube, talking about different methods of protection that fit more people. And also when we're talking about consent education, making it inclusive of race and disability. One thing in Decolonize and Deconstruct that we talked about quite a bit was the importance of non-sexual consent. And for many of us, as we were Black and Brown and Indigenous students, talked about experiences that we all had of either hair touching or hijab touching, or just inappropriate touching, even though it wasn't necessarily sexual, it was still kind of an invasion of space and privacy, right? Because consent goes so much further than just sex and sexual acts itself. And so when we think about disability, we think about different methods of support or assistance devices that certain folks might need to help them on a regular basis. That could be a wheelchair, that could be a cane, any kind of, again, other assistance device. And so thinking about, encouraging folks from a young age and talking to folks about not touching those, right? About how it's an extension of people's bodies, about how it has to do directly with consent, is how it's not just a toy or something for you to touch. It's part of people's, part of themselves and part of their property and part of their agency, being able to kind of have control of who has access to those things and to those parts of them. And then also providing accessible sexual health education. So today, of course, we have ASL interpreters, being able to have access to closed captions, really just providing education that everybody can absorb and also be part of. That's one of the things that over the last 5 years of doing workshop facilitation, one thing that always is most important to me is trying my best to be relatable, but also not use jargon, not treat it like a conference or a symposium every time, not to use academic language, because we're having just real conversations, right? And so being able to just have these conversations in ways that that everyone can understand and that everyone is comfortable with, we see, especially when we think of social determinants of health, when we think of intersectionality, a big one that comes to mind for people both living with disabilities as well as people of color, particularly Black folks, is class, right? So thinking about class, thinking about education, thinking about access, keep that in mind when you're even doing things like offering resources or thinking about ways for people to take in the information that you're sharing. And finally, I think it's also important, I always try to end any conversation on a note of resources and thinking of kind of tangible objects that people can take along to talk more about this and to continue conversations and to use in their everyday lives. And so there's incredible resources and information on disability and sex, disability and HIV, disability and race, and what that could look like for people. And so we have the UN AIDS report on disability and HIV. There's an article called People with Disabilities, HIV and AIDS. Realize Canada is a really great organization who focuses on HIV and aging, and as well as HIV and disability, and supporting people living with HIV who are going through the changes of their bodies aging with HIV, as well as people living with disabilities and HIV. The Public Health Agency of Canada's questions and answers document. It's a report on sexual health education for youth with physical disabilities. Health Canada's HIV and AIDS disability report, that's on Canadian AIDS treatment information exchange. And then of course, the African and Caribbean Council on HIV and AIDS in Ontario. So all of these places do really great work and have really great information to kind of delve deeper a little bit into this subject. But I think when we talk about rape culture and when we talk about consent and disability, it's important to remember that these things are not exclusive of each other. They absolutely have everything to do with one another, and we can't talk about one without the other. So when we talk about sexual health education and when we talk about HIV prevention, it's crucial to the prevention of HIV that we include disability and we include eradicating ableism and racism, including that in the conversation. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to listening to my fellow panelists.
Thank you so much, Lydia. Your presentation was extremely informative, and I really appreciate you adding the resources at the end. I will be introducing the next panelist, who is Sarah Mann. Their presentation is titled Crazy, Inappropriate, and Probably Lying, Harley Quinn versus the Mental Health Establishment. Sarah Mann is an academic, activist, and artist living in Sudbury, Ontario. She writes and teaches about poverty, sex work, harm reduction, mental health, and feminism. Her writing can be found in This Magazine, Briarpatch, Rabble.ca, The Hamilton Spectator, and more. Sarah is working on a community arts project to build solidarity amongst poor people and with a group of Anishinaabe families on a storytelling project related to their experiences with the children's aid system. She blogs at autocannibalism.wordpress.com. You're currently on mute.
There we go. Sorry, I'm an academic over the age of 30, and I have no idea how to work any of this technology. I've been having a silent war with my printer over here. Am I supposed to be talking now?
Yes.
Oh God. Okay, I need to figure out how to share my PowerPoint.
So if you look at the bottom bar of your screen, there's a green box that has an arrow and it says share screen.
Okay.
If you just click onto that, you will be able to click onto a screen that you will have your PowerPoint or presentation on, and just line that up. If you want, I can let you know once it's on the screen.
I am on my phone. is it possible? Can you turn on my PowerPoint? Oh God, this is so embarrassing.
I do not know how to turn it on from like a phone. I will double check to see if I have it, and then I can share my screen possibly. Just give me 1 second, please.
Okay. In the meantime, I'll introduce myself. I let them swipe an old bio. So the project I was working on with the Anishinaabe families is now complete and can be found in Briar Patch magazine. And it worked out really well. We had a storytelling session where group members wrote about their own experiences in the child welfare system. And one of them has her first publication alongside the article in the magazine, talking about her experience of being adopted during the 60s scoop.
I have received your presentation. It's just loading, so please just give me a few more minutes. Sorry about that.
Okay, I'll keep talking. So I'm going to talk about some of my own experiences today, and they were built into the presentation, but I can tell them in advance and then we can use them as we go through the presentation. So once upon a time, I was a Brock student, and I came from poverty. I had no money, no family money. I worked as a sex worker to support paying my tuition. And I grew up in a very abusive home. So I grew up with mental illness. And what at the time I didn't really understand, but was later understood to be post-traumatic stress disorder. There's a correlation between experiences of sexual abuse and experiences of suicidal ideation, suicide attempts. So for those in Margot's class, I imagine you've already read a story in this magazine about, this magazine is the title of the magazine, about being a suicide attempt survivor and how that ends up being a very complicated issue to try to treat because nobody wants to talk about suicide. As we get into the discussion about Harley Quinn and the mental health system, then we're going to talk a lot about sexual abuse and sexual assault and suicide. So I'm just going to add that extra trigger warning. Oh. My own stories at Brock, the one that I'm going to use today is a story about a time when I was arrested under the Mental Health Act. My student loan collector thought I sounded distressed on the phone. So they called the police to my house. The police dragged me to the hospital. Once I was at the hospital, I was wearing nothing but pajama pants and a tank top. So that was my only layer of clothes. And I said, I don't want to take my clothes off to put on a gown. I tried explaining that I was a sexual assault survivor and that I had PTSD and that what they were doing was not therapeutic. And like this giant ape of a cop screamed at me that I had no rights, which was uncomfortable. And then they took me into the bathroom and a female officer and a nurse stripped me of my clothes and forced me to put on the gown. And the reason I got to go home is because my dear friend Margot called the hospital every 15 minutes until they let me go. Later, I had a psychiatric assessment, and the psychiatrist brought in a student. He told me he was a medical student. I asked if I could say no to having the student present during my assessment. And he said, well, it is a teaching hospital, you know, so we do take medical students around. And later on, he said, technically, he didn't lie. in the middle of the assessment, I mentioned going to Brock and being a master's student there. And the psychiatrist said, "Oh, Sean here is a master's student at Brock too." And we'll talk more about the outcomes of that, because I did try very hard to complain to Brock, to the hospital, to OGS, who was sponsoring the students' research. And it gets into what makes our stories so complicated. Michelle, or...
Yep, we have your PowerPoint up. I'm not sure if you can see it on your end.
I can, yes. Should I get going?
Whenever you'd like to.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about Harley Quinn as sort of a representative for survivors of sexual assault and sexual abuse in the mental health system, and what this figure means, and what her story means, and what our stories mean to us and to the system. It's a bit of a bummer for most of the talk. You'll see it's crazy, inappropriate, and probably lying. And the reason for that is because these stories are quite difficult to tell. Next slide. You're my hero. So this is Harley Quinn. This slide is brought to you by a hard lesson on proofreading my PowerPoint presentations before emailing them off. So Harley Quinn is a character in the DC Comics universe, and she was created by Paul Dini, D-I-N-I for the ASL translators, and Bruce Timm, T-I-M-M. Her first appearance was, as pictured here, in Batman the Animated Series, and she was conceived of as a comedic foil for the Joker. So she was a henchwoman instead of a henchman, and because she was a henchwoman, she could say things that the other subordinates couldn't without being a challenge to the Joker's position of authority, or without being too much of a challenge. So she got to be sassy and make some sarcastic remarks and give the Joker some comedic relief, because he's a very dark character in most cases. Her more recent and popular appearances are in Suicide Squad and Birds of Prey, where she's played by Margot Robbie. And in these stories, as well as in more recent iterations in the comics, she is portrayed as a survivor of an abusive, codependent relationship with the Joker. And there's scenes of him abusing her physically, sexually, and emotionally. There are scenes of her enacting what are considered to be codependent behaviors, so going back to him and trying to get back into this relationship over and over. But very important to the story is that as time has gone on, as fans have contributed back to DC and demanded new writings of Harley Quinn, she's become more of a feminist redemption story. So she's moved on from her codependent behaviors. She's still crazy, but she's independent. She don't need no man. Her characterization is as nihilistic, self-destructive, chaotic, anti-authoritarian, codependent, sexually provocative, but not necessarily sexually available, because she is dangerous. Justice seeking, so she has a reason to be as angry as she is, but she's irreparably biased by her skewed understanding of reality, and she's fundamentally contradictory. So she's the ultimate anti-hero. Her super abilities, depending which version you read, she might have been injected with Poison Ivy's special potion, or the Joker's special potion, or she might just be very talented at gymnastics, but she's got a very high IQ. She's supposed to be very intelligent. She has a PhD, and she's very strong. She's impervious to toxins and to other forms of harm. So physically, you can't hurt her. She's manipulative because she understands psychology. She can trick people. She can lie. And her primary super ability is that she's unpredictable, which says a lot about the super abilities of Batman and his cronies. If all it takes for someone to become a woman, specifically to become a supervillain, is for her to be unpredictable to them. The next slide has a couple of images from DC Comics. They held a contest for readers. They wanted people to submit images depicting various suicide attempts by Harley Quinn. So these are the images that DC Comics released. You can see in one, she's trying to get herself electrocuted. Next, she's trying to get eaten by alligators and then standing in some sort of beast's mouth. And then the image that got a lot of negative attention, understandably, is Harley Quinn naked in the bathtub, trying to fry herself with various electronics. So the connection between this character as an abuse survivor, as suicidal, and as fundamentally contradictory and dangerous because she is unpredictable has been built into not just this character, but into the archetypes and tropes that inform it. So into the stories that we tell ourselves about sexual violence and mental health, and that our culture has told us for generations over time. So stories of the mad woman, the crazy cat lady, the manic pixie dream girl, except in this case now she's the manic pixie nightmare. Those archetypes of women who have been damaged by sexual violence are all sort of built into Harley Quinn. And because of that, she can be everything to everyone. She's pornified and sexually appealing, if that's what you want to see. Her creators have talked about rewriting her because they don't want her to be such a doormat anymore. But at the same time, in portrayals in Suicide Squad, she's, I don't know if shown to be, but it's suggested that she's sexually submissive, that she, to some extent, likes the abuse the Joker inflicts upon her. So she might still be a bit of a doormat. And of course, the whole idea that someone who is avoiding harm to themselves is a doormat comes in there. She's empowered. Asked one cosplayer what she likes about dressing up as Harley Quinn and why she relates to the character, and she said it's freeing. So her lack of boundaries lets fans, readers, cosplayers, etc., express feelings that they would otherwise be silent about. And that is empowering. But at the same time, she's also deeply, deeply sexualized. So if you're going to cosplay as Harley Quinn, you need to start taking some clothes off. And that's part of the character. It can't be separated. Okay, so next slide. Michelle, you are my hero. I won't get into too much detail here because it's probably more interesting to me than to anyone else. But when we talk about survivor stories, there's a lot that goes into a story aside from just its content or just the words used to tell it. So some of the words I'm going to use are, first of all, myth and history. And when I say myth, I'm referring to those archetypes that collectively created and commonly understood types and categories of stories and characters that we use as kind of like the skeletons for the stories we tell. They help us make them understandable to other people. And then history, to the extent that it's possible to have an objective, universal view of what happens in the world, that's what history refers to. So the actual events and facts established either within the universe of the story or within reality that are true, literal, and that anyone looking at them could see. And again, that's always mediated by who you are and where you're coming from. So there are situations where there is truly and literally and objectively racism going on, and I can't see it because I'm white. That doesn't mean that it's not there. It means that I have lenses in between me and the details of history that fog up my vision. I have work to do before I can see what's there for everyone or what's objectively present, objectively. So we take history with a grain of salt because we don't always have the ability to see and to communicate what's there. But for the most part, we mean it, when I talk about it, I mean the facts of something, the events and experiences. The next pair we have is the telling and the text. So the telling is the actual event of communicating a story. So either writing it or when somebody picks up a book and reads it. In this case, when I talked to you and Michelle helped me change slides because I'm a dinosaur. And then the text, which is the record of the telling. So that might be a digital record like the PowerPoint here. It might be a book, or it might just be a memory. And again, that makes the text, like history, subject to a bit of flexibility. Finally, we have the narrative and the meaning. So a narrative is always curated, edited, and ordered. We decide what's going to go in the story and where and in what order. And we do that because we want the story to have a particular weight or meaning. So the political and social and emotional record of the story, how it makes you feel, the interpretation and the impact of it. If a story changes the world, then that's a part of the record. Or it's an imagining. So something that has not existed yet, but that we want to model through the story. I'm sorry that was so long, but that's the short version. Okay, next slide. So within the mental health system, when survivors encounter it, they do so usually because there is a strong correlation, unsurprisingly, between experiencing sexual violence and having poor mental health or attempting suicide. This is true for everyone. It's especially true for bisexual women, Black women. About 10% of men who have been sexually assaulted experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. I didn't put this in my notes, so I'm just remembering as I go. And again, it's always mediated by who you are and where you're coming from. So the structures in society that create discrimination, that create more difficult lives or more privileged lives based on things like race and class, sexuality, gender identity, ethnicity, country of origin, will change the ways that, the extent to which your mental health suffers after an experience of sexual violence, and also the ways that you suffer afterwards, because that contextual setting is important to what happens next. The outcomes permeate all areas of your life. So interpersonal relationships, education, and work. And the mental health establishment has recognized this. It's not that the outcomes survivors experience have been invisible at any point. But in recognizing it, the mental health establishment has individualized and pathologized the connection between sexual violence and poor mental health. in my opinion, the symptoms of PTSD are a very reasonable reaction to what actually happens in the course of sexual violence. But from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, you would see that PTSD isn't a reaction anymore. It's a disorder. It's something wrong with me. And so in doing so, the mental health establishment creates a binary of types of victims, because there's the victim who didn't cause her sexual assault. So when I was a child and I was abused by my father, I was an ideal victim in the sense that most people would not blame a child for the abuse they experience. When I was older and I was raped in the course of doing sex work, once at a client's home and then 2 years later at my own home, I was no longer an ideal victim because I was engaging in risky and promiscuous behavior. Promiscuous came up a lot in my psychiatric assessments. And in a sense, I was asking for it. So just like Harley Quinn, I was seeking out, or I was admitting to wanting or liking that abuse in some way, which once you take it in the context, like the social context it occurred in, I wasn't promiscuous. I was just fucking poor. I needed money. So I did sex work. But because of how the mental health establishment individualizes these experiences and makes them disorders and something wrong with us, that context isn't a part of the diagnosis. So we see the ideal victim a lot in Lifetime movies, and it creates an ideal perpetrator to go with it. So one of the difficulties I have talking about sexual abuse is that when I say sexual abuse, we all picture sort of that Lifetime movie, the pedophile cracking open the door to look at the little girl sleeping in the bed. And we imagine this almost romantic storyline of gentle manipulation, and the actual ugly truth of what happened, of a violent drunk man getting aroused by punching me in the breasts when I was a child, is so inappropriate that it can't even be told comfortably in the context of a sexual abuse story. And the mental health establishment rewrites that kind of experience as a borderline personality, which is applied most often to women. When men are able to talk about their experiences of sexual violence, when those experiences are recognized and treated, then often they get diagnosed as having antisocial personalities for the same reason, that they're broken, in short. And there's an old doctor's joke about, what do you do with a borderline patient? The answer is you refer her to somebody else. So borderline personality disorder is considered incurable, and the patient who has it is considered to be manipulative, promiscuous, has no sense of self, will lie and cheat to get attention, and is destructive to herself and to everyone around her. Her personal relationships are always very unstable. So, and those are morally loaded labels to put on someone. So the sexual violence survivor is damaged by someone else's behavior in this view of her, but also it's her fault that she hasn't gotten over it. All right, next slide. is it a lot of work for my face to be the screen right now? That seems complicated. I'm sorry, guys. I'm very old. I'm secretly like 90. So the different types of stories that we tell in this context of the mental health establishment, and often trying to respond to the harms of the mental health establishment. I've written them as confession, disclosure, testimony, and autobiography. Confession, I chose that word because there's a connotation of shame and guilt. So when you're applying for welfare, you have to confess your traumatic experiences to the worker to prove that you're deserving of this mercy, and that you're as close to an ideal victim as possible. Confession was also present in that psychiatric assessment I was telling you guys about when they snuck a Brock student in while one of my colleagues at Brock while I was also studying there. When I found out that he was a student, they still didn't let me ask him to leave. But all of these details I had shared with the psychiatrist, all of these stories suddenly became not just stories about my own personal mental health, but stories about me as a scholar and as a worker. And they became things that the student and the psychiatrist and pretty much anyone who wanted to could use if they wanted to stigmatize and dismiss me and what I said. So, and the outcome was very much that. People who tell stories about surviving sexual abuse and sexual violence are perceived by audiences as less likable than people telling other kinds of stories about trauma. And it does not matter whether you tell a redemptive story, so one where you get over it and don't need no man, like Harley Quinn, or the ugly truth of the story, if that's what your experience has been. They don't like you, or they like you less than they like somebody telling the same story but about an earthquake. So in order to complain to the hospital ombudsperson, I had to tell the story again. And then when I went to complain to graduate studies at Brock, I had to tell the story again. So right off the bat, confession is admitting to this guilt, to being damaged and kind of to blame for not being over it. Everybody was very nice to my face. I remember speaking to someone in the department in which the student was studying about what happened, and he seemed very sympathetic. He seemed to believe me. And then later on, he was speaking, I believe, to Margot, and said, well, she's probably misremembering. I mean, she was very worked up. So it didn't matter what I had said. It didn't matter that I had tried to say no, or that the doctor had implied that this was a medical student. The nearest medical school would have been McMaster in Hamilton. Because right off the bat, before I even mentioned what happened between me and the doctor and the student, my story as a sexual assault survivor, the details that I had been forced to disclose to a colleague in that situation, made me an unreliable narrator. And so that story concludes just, I don't know, I feel like I have to give you guys an ending to it. With a meeting at the hospital, they told me that the student wouldn't be present. He was present. They told me that the doctor wouldn't be present. He was present too. I brought my close friend, who also happened to be my union rep, with me. Thank goodness for that, because it was a very intimidating situation. And then after the meeting, they sent me a letter saying that I was remembering the situation wrong. And as far as they were concerned, the fact that I went ahead with the assessment after the doctor told me I couldn't say no, and this was a situation where I'd been arrested under the Mental Health Act. You have to submit to psychiatric assessment or they can hold you against your will. So because I went ahead with the assessment instead of having them hold me against my will for 3 days, they considered that to be consent. The story I told you about the other arrest under the Mental Health Act when they stripped me of my clothes, that one, I would put more in terms of disclosure because it affected me at work and I had to tell somebody what was happening. So disclosure in that case was practical, it was useful. It enabled Margot to call over and over and drive them completely fucking batty. To make sure that I was safe. And because I had to teach the next day, the worst day ever, I could not stop crying. So I would cry in between classes all day. And then as soon as the class started, I would put on my Teacher Sarah costume and walk in and play it straight. But it was just a terrible experience the next day. I had to disclose to my bosses, I had to disclose to my union. Even I wouldn't disclose the details to students, but I did disclose, I'm sorry, I'm having a bit of a rough day. So sometimes we employ disclosure for our own purposes. Yeah, so that was how that story ended, with a terrible day. I remember telling the nurse who stripped me as I walked out of the hospital after they released me. She asked the doctor to assess me and release me first because Margot was driving her crazy. That I felt exactly the way I felt after I was raped. And there was no difference, at least from my perspective. Testimony, another way of telling stories. This is testimony, when you tell your story as advocacy and as a way to inspire change. In these cases, our stories are not only personal, but they're also political. And this is generally a good experience for survivors telling stories. So the Me Too movement led to a lot of research on what happens when you tell your story online, what happens when you tell your story on Twitter versus Instagram. I think Instagram was turned out to be the better environment for what that's worth. And they found that even among audiences for these stories, just listening to them created new groups. They called them intimate publics. So people who didn't know each other, who came together as audiences for these stories and shared their own secrets with each other. And then the last version, I'm going to tell you one last story to go with it, is as autobiography. So sometimes you just need to talk about the details of your life. And the story I'll tell you is, I have a service dog. Her name is Mila. You might be able to hear her whining in the background. She just had surgery and I made her wear underpants. She is not happy, but she is not chewing her stitches. She was with me in class and a professor demanded to know why I had a service dog, what was wrong with me, why I had PTSD, how long ago I was raped, and then said something along the lines of, oh, at the time it was 8 years prior. 8 years is a long time. You're not over it yet. So I complained to the administration because I don't know, I'm not going to sit there and take it. And said, you know, this makes a class impossible for me to take. Like, how do I go in? How do I study closely with this professor after he's dismissed so much of who I am and what colors my experience. The play I was writing with him or with his supervision was about a suicide crisis hotline worker who himself is suicidal. And sexual violence was woven throughout that story because sexual violence is woven throughout suicide stories. That's just the reality of them. And every time I brought up what he said, I had to mention my rape. And I remember one time talking to this administrator and she goes, whoa, 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 Sarah. We have already provided you with links to counseling, so I don't think we need to talk about rape today. And I responded, I'm not talking about rape today. I'm talking about this professor being incompetent. But these are the facts of my life. I'm not having a mental breakdown and sharing it with you for that reason. It's just necessary to, now you can hear my dogs, or it's just necessary to relate these details to you. Next slide. Okay. And I'm going to give you a couple seconds to look at the slide, and then if it's not too much trouble, Michelle, could we switch back to my beautiful face, just so people can see me smiling and gesturing, and hopefully not be too freaked out by the content of the stories. So there's two lessons that I've learned from telling these stories, and that I want to communicate to others. The first, I'll give you a few more seconds to read. Okay, at this point, oh, Michelle, you are a hero.
Just have to give a shout out to Rabia. She's the one doing the screen sharing. But
oh, okay, Rabia, thank you.
No worries.
Okay, I see my video going. How do I make myself on the screen?
we can see you.
Oh, you can?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I was making a really funny face there. Shit. So the two takeaways I want to go over are, first, we have a right to tell our stories as survivors. Sometimes it's very difficult to do so, but it can be important to us for a number of reasons. I'll get into those briefly in a second. And the second is we don't have to mean to matter. So yes, we have a right to tell our stories, but no, we don't have to be our stories 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, performing for others. Claiming Harley Quinn. Why did I write that? Oh, okay. So I wrote about claiming Harley Quinn. So about taking this trope and making it our own or embodying it in some way. I was thinking about the woman who cosplays as Harley Quinn and her experience that it was freeing. And many other fans write about Harley Quinn as empowering, because she does get to be herself. She gets to be a sexual being without being vulnerable to sexual violence. She gets to be angry. And my God, are we fucking angry? So often and so quietly and so inappropriately, that we never, if we're trying to embody the ideal victim, we never get to express that anger. So, and it feels good to be able to say, I'm really angry. For me, I have made a decision to be openly crazy. Part of that is just a matter of privilege or lack of privilege. So it's just not an option for me to pretend I'm not crazy. or to hide this aspect of my life because I walk around with a service dog and otherwise can't leave my house. And I have days where I can't stop crying. And my life changed, especially after the second rape. I'm watching the closed captioning do everything possible to avoid using the word rape. Oh, there we go. And my life changed. And sometimes I need to explain to people why I'm not the person they knew in high school. And also I'm just not very well organized. It's a lot of work to hide parts of who you are in your work life and from certain people. So I talk about my mental health whenever it's relevant. I write about it. I do worry sometimes that on my CV, there are multiple stories that just have the words mental illness and suicide, sex work, things like that in them. So I do worry to some extent about the possibility of discrimination, but it's about survival. It is more practical for me to not have to hide than it is for me to guard against every potential act of discrimination by someone else. This allows me to integrate the details of my autobiography, my history, into my identity and into my story. This fractured experience doesn't have to be set aside. It helps me understand who I am. It helps me communicate who I am to others. And it resolves some of the problems that make suicide and sexual violence such close companions. So alexithymia is the inability to identify and name one's emotions. So when you have that all-encompassing pain, that blackness, that thing that just needs to go away, that makes you feel like you should kill yourself to get away from it, that's not a feeling, or that's not the emotion at work. The emotion is anger, sadness, loneliness, hopelessness, something with a name. And telling the story behind those suicidal thoughts and that big, icky, overwhelming feeling that seems unnameable helps you find out what your emotions actually are and helps you to address them and resolve them in healthy ways. And it also helps, telling a story helps to resolve dissociative symptoms. So if your life is fractured, your identity is fractured. And you have what's called dissociative identity disorder now was called in the past multiple personality disorder. And the TV imagining of it is that we take on whole new names and personas. The reality of it is more that sometimes you just don't feel like a grown-up. And some part of you is stuck, or your ability to emotionally process is stuck at an earlier stage of development. Sometimes you can't remember things. So it's not quite as dramatic as you see on TV, but those unpredictable changes in personality and behavior, Harley Quinn's super ability, and for the rest of us, a frightening and unpredictable and disruptive experience that ruins our fucking days, is resolved by integrating your experiences into one story and being able to tell yourself and others that story and remember who you are, and address the problems in the story. So if my ability to express anger without becoming self-destructive kind of stopped developing when I was 16 because my life was just too overwhelming for me to work on that. once I know that that's what the problem is, once I've integrated that part of my story into the ongoing narrative of me, I can come up with a solution. But our lives don't end with our stories. This is where, when experiences of sexual violence become experiences of suicide attempts, that redemptive story that, you know, I was in crisis, I went to the hospital, I wanted to kill myself, but then I talked about my feelings and it got better, and that Black feeling went away. The end. The story ends, but our lives don't. So the next day I will be suicidal again, and the next week, and I might get sexually assaulted again. So there's a life outside of the fairy tale that we need the freedom to live. And that means reconciling not only with the integrated story of our past or our histories, but also with our unedited, disordered, chaotic, unpredictable selves, which, before they become stories, just won't and can't ever line up with the demands of the mental health establishment and redemption and the archetypes of survivors. And now I'm done.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Sarah. It was deeply introspective and highly educational. So our last panelist of the night is Jiaqing. Jiaqing is a trans-Chinese Irish settler living in Toronto in the dish with one spoon territory. She works at X University at Consent Comes First, the Office of Sexual Violence Support and Education, as a sexual violence specialist. She has been supporting survivors of gender-based violence for 10 years. Outside of GBV work, she is a writer of poetry and fiction. Her work can be found in Rice Paper Magazine, Carte Blanche, Maison Neuve, Poetry is Dead, and Room Magazine. Her first novel, Small Beauty, was published by Mutiny Press and won a Lambada Award for Best Transgender Fiction. The title of her presentation is How Regulating Bodies and Defining Gender-Based Violence Prevents Barriers to Service. Jiaqing, you can start whenever you're ready.
Great. I am just going to move this to present mode. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much, Margot and folks, for inviting me. The title that I gave you, I definitely threw together at the last minute. I'm not even really sure what I meant, trying to sound cool. So this is the title that I've landed on. Again, I don't know that that's totally what I'm going to talk about, but why not? Put some slides together. Thanks so much, folks, for tuning in and sticking around. This is definitely a really hard topic to be talking about and listening to for a couple of hours. So I really appreciate you all being here. And if you're not already, I would say stretch as much as you can, drink lots of water, that kind of thing. And thank you so much to our interpreters for doing the ASL interpretation throughout this talk. Okay. Yeah, so I'm gonna introduce myself. I always like to give a bit about my social location when I'm speaking, when I'm working with folks. So yeah, there's histories of violence in my family, both as folks who committed acts of violence, folks who survived acts of violence. I'm a transsexual settler, mixed race, like we said, with a small collection of DSM diagnoses and some ADHD. But yeah, so that's me with a mask on. So what I'm going to do I'm gonna go through some stats and then talk a little bit about them. I was really trying to think about a good way to talk about gender-based violence and disability. I don't really have a thesis about what I'm going to talk about, but I think it would be interesting and helpful for folks, especially as we're thinking about how disability and gender-based violence connect in our day-to-day lives, just to sort of, explore some statistics, some history, and just some concepts around disabled bodies and sexual violence, disabled bodies and institutional violence as well. So here I've got some Stats Canada statistics. They're saying 24% of women and 20% of men live with a disability. So we're already seeing in Statistics Canada's numbers, like kind of a feminization of disability, right? It's not a huge number in this survey, but I would wonder, and other explorations of this, like what we would find. Transpulse from last year tells us that trans and non-binary people in Canada are 43% of us are identifying as psych survivors, MAD, or people with mental illnesses. 30% of us are neurodivergent, and 19% of us are living with a disability. With the previous Stats Can stat from 2017 of the 24% of women, I'm definitely curious how respondents would have identified if they were given as many options as Transpulse gives, right? Like breaking down psych survivor, MAD, person with mental illness, neurodivergence, and living with a disability as different categories. So, not what I wanted to do. And then also from, jury stat, just connected to Stats Canada, women with disabilities are more likely to report violent crime. And when these kinds of statistics are collected, very often, well, not very often, though the rubric that we're using to describe women is very binary. And I'm always curious when I see that, how trans folks are being included in those stats, how they're being read, if they are, how we're thinking about gender. And then also from Stats Canada from this year, they're saying that more than 50% of women with disabilities have experienced intimate partner violence. So I think, concurrent with what other folks have been saying this evening, folks with disabilities, especially, the numbers we have for women, I'm going to make the assumption that it's cis women with disabilities experience high levels of violence, right? But we don't have the same kind of comprehensive statistics about trans and non-binary folks or intersex folks and their experiences of violence. So here we've got trans people are more likely to experience sexual violence since the age of 15 than cis people. That's just broadly without thinking about disability. But when we pair that with the amount of trans people that Transpulse has identified as having disability or identifying as disabled or having some kind of mental illness, there's going to be a lot of crossover, right? Sexual minority Canadians are more likely than straight people to experience sexual violence. I'm seeing, oh yeah, no, that makes sense. I put that in quotes because, I still, and bisexual women, which Sarah touched on a little bit, are more likely than lesbian women and straight women to experience sexual violence. And then sort of, again, more broadly, with sexual violence, I've got 1 in 2, 1 in 6, 1 in 3 at the bottom. So stats that we use at my work in training, 1 in 2 trans and non-binary people will experience sexual violence at some point in their life, 1 in 6 men and 1 in 3 women. So now that I've flooded you all with numbers, my big takeaway from this is that sexual violence and gender-based violences are around all of us all the time. It's within the context that we're living in. So like we live in a rape culture, and disability, no surprise, puts people like at risk of experiencing more sexual violence. Okay, so when we have stats like that, we're building a story, right? So I guess like jumping off from what Sarah was talking about in terms of sharing stories, and we're creating a story of who experiences violence, how they experience violence, and we built the narrative, right? So that narrative when I was looking at these, really got me thinking of some different things I had read over the years in terms of how we assume people will be heard, how we start to integrate those numbers, right? So it really made me think of Achille Mbembe in his article and then book Necropolitics, where he talks about sovereignty and that kind of power as being rooted in the right to kill, being rooted in the right to take another person's life, to exact some kind of violent punishment, which I think connects pretty directly with Shireen Razak's work around memorializing colonial power, and her saying that some bodies are relegated to death worlds, they are the living dead. So this idea that of creating or positioning other bodies as bodies that can, be punished, be controlled, bodies that will always be vulnerable. They're inevitable victims. You can't move away from that. And when we start to think about how that relates to disabled bodies, we start to think about how that relates to racialized bodies and trans and intersex bodies. These are bodies that all fit outside of a normal, right? And they are all controlled in different ways, often in overlapping ways, right? So there's medical control, legal control, that kind of thing. So that made me think about how that phenomenon might translate to gender-based violence. And how does this help us contextualize who is a victim and who is seen as a victim? So to take those ideas and try and thread them together, it puts me to a point of like, what, when we talk about death worlds, like whose bodies are seen to be okay to sexually assault? Whose bodies do we understand as being able to be sexually assaulted, right? Okay, yeah. What is she talking about? So that makes me think about how bodies are valued in capitalism, what bodies are worth things in the capitalist state we live in, and ties into this person Campbell, who talks about disability being seen as a diminished state of a human being, right? So something that's less than, something that is not quite a person. And there's lots of different ways that throughout the history of the Western world, the definition of who people are and what counts as, certain kinds of people, many people are viewed as less than. So, yeah. So we have this diminished state of a human being, right? We've got this of normal bodies. My points are a little bit out of order. And while that's happening, and so this second quote, I'm pointing at my screen, you can't see that, but where it says bodies seen as containers in which people live, that's from the work of a non-binary scholar named Gemma Tosh, and their book, The Body and Consent in Psychology, Psychiatry, and Medicine, which is fascinating for anyone that's interested in reading about psychology, the history of psychology, the history of psychiatry. It's definitely heavy, but I found it really interesting. And she starts talking about the ways that bodies started to be seen as, bodies are seen as containers in which we live in, right? Like I think, therefore I am. I'm a entity housed within this shell rather than the body actually being connected to yourself, right? So when doctors try and fix someone's body or try to make a body that's seen as abnormal normal, they're not necessarily thinking about how that impacts the person. They're just treating the body like it's some kind of shell that we're in. Okay, so we've got that happening, and then at the same time that this idea of the body as a container starts to emerge in like 1800s, 1900s, you get the establishment of what a normal body is, right? And that normal body is the white, cis, able-bodied male body, right? Also the people who had access to education, right? Like, during those times. So Male bodies then get seen as complete and full, and female bodies start to be seen as empty, things that can be receptacles, right? So all of this starts to create a context where somebody, yes, sorry, fucking place. Okay, all that starts to create a context where you can, where we start like having a lot more medical and institutional violence, ways that disability is being controlled, right? So I've got granting normalcy in quotes when we think about what intersex folks and trans folks may experience as we're moving through medicalization. So this idea that there's the power to return your body to normal, and that it's some kind of favor for you, but those surgeries are not always consensual and involve maintenance practices like dilation that may also not be consensual when we think about things happening to kiddos, to children. So yeah, once there's this establishment of a normal, then people start to correct around that. The other thing that comes to mind when we're talking about gender-based violence and disability is how, and Lydia spoke about it a little bit, how people are able to access sexuality and to be sexual beings. So there's an idea that folks with disabilities would not be able to, have sex or want sex, or that they don't have the ability to consent, and consent is definitely, some folks will have different relationships with their ability to consent in sex, but the idea that it's not possible, that there's no way to communicate around consent is really, kind of a cop out. We're not looking for ways to do that when we could be. So when people get desexualized and their bodies are seen as containers, right, it allows medical institutions, it allows other institutions and people to do things to those bodies, to take actions upon those bodies without feeling like they're causing any harm. So it took me a little while to get there, but I did. So that like really sets up this narrative that disabled bodies can be interacted with in certain ways without it being a moral problem, right? Coupled with that, believability, which Sarah spoke quite a bit about this evening, and like how people interact with stories. And then this idea that the doctor knows best, and the doctor knows more about your body than you do, right? And that is deeply rooted in white supremacy and sexism. The photo that I have here is a photo of the Huronia Regional Center, which was in Aurelia and was a center where folks with intellectual disabilities and probably learning disabilities were sent to live in this sort of residential environment. And all kinds of violences happened there. And part of what allowed them to happen was that the people who were there were seen as somehow diminished human beings, right? And that establishment closed, like I'm pretty sure within my lifetime. So that means that the people that worked there, the people that created that, the people that maintained that are still alive. They're probably working other places. Like, so these ideas continue, right? And those ideas are very much rooted in the sort of construction of normal that I talked about before, and how that construction of normal allows for this continuation of assault. So my point, some bodies are seen as worthy of violence. Some bodies are seen as bodies that, can experience harm without it, or can be harmed without necessarily being understood to be harmed. Some bodies are seen as pitiable and needing to be fixed, which means that doctors and different institutions may feel like they can sort of have their way with that. And And it's acceptable for some bodies to be harmed while some bodies cannot be conceptualized as being able to experience harm. So we think about bodies that, the container is seen to be damaged. People might be like, oh, well, that they can't experience harm. When we think about trans women and this idea of normal being this sort of cis man that's full and complete and can't experience harm, can't be raped, the conflation of trans women with men sets us up as people that are seen as it's not possible for us to be victims, right? And part of why so many of our stats, I think, don't include a broader range of genders and a deeper understanding of gender-based violence and who experiences it is because we get stuck in this concept of who can be assaulted. Yeah, anyway, probably a longer talk. So my point is that we're all affected by gender-based violence. And some of us in different ways than others. But when we want to think about how to engage with it, I think that it's expanding our understanding of gender-based violence to see that it impacts all bodies, that all bodies can be harmed, and that needs to be reflected in the marketing. It needs to be reflected in outreach, right? So if you were to Google violence against women, or if you were to Google sexual assault, you're going to see a particular set of images, mostly of white cis women looking really sad or hurt, holding up their hands, crying. That's what you're going to see. That's what you're going to see as represented as people who can legitimately experience sexual violence. The rest of us aren't necessarily included in that, right? So yeah, I would say we need to expand our understanding of gender-based violence. We need to start offering all gender services and more than just sort of lip service to the Human Rights Code, right? Because now trans people need to be granted access to certain places, right? And you can be discriminated against on the basis of disability, but all gender services would mean that you've got programs for male identified survivors, you've got programs for trans people broadly, you've got programs for trans women, you've got programs for non-binary folks, you've got programs for cis folks. Like, you're really thinking about all kinds of different bodies in those spaces, right? The staff needs to be racially diverse, like especially when we're thinking about, in the GTA where I'm living, in Ontario, in Canada, in the world, people need to be able to see themselves represented, which also leads to needing trans and non-binary staff. And I am not a non-binary person. I am very much binary identified. So I don't actually know what the experiences of a non-binary person are. So, not conflating trans and non-binary people. Obviously, spaces need to be physically accessible. Part of me was like, don't put that in. But then at the same time, even where I work at X University, buttons don't work for doors or whatever, right? Like it's frustrating that we're still at a point where I feel like that needs to be a reminder, but it does. And then an understanding of medical sexual violence. It is a pretty big topic to start to delve into, but the idea, we don't necessarily think about it as sexual violence, but when we're thinking about experiences of trans folks and intersex folks who are medicalized, right? Who, in order for me to access the care that I needed to access, I needed to get a mental health diagnosis as having a mental illness, which I'm fine with that labeling, but it does mean that, my gender is seen as a disability, which is a whole other kettle of fish. But an understanding of the ways that those medical systems either treat our bodies like curiosities or force surgeries upon folks, right? And understanding that is gender-based violence, because it's very connected to gender and it's violent, not to belabor the point. And then within that, we need spaces for survivors to connect with each other, right? A huge part of healing from sexual violence and gender-based violence that sort of last step of reconnection. So Judith Herman in Trauma and Recovery talks about it quite eloquently, where she says like the first step is this safety and stabilization, right, after an assault, and then remembrance and mourning, and then reconnection. So it can't just be a space where people just go for one-off counseling. It's got to involve some community building, in my humble opinion. That is what I have to share with you this evening. Yeah, but really look forward to the questions. I know this was a little scattered, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Jiaqing, for your presentation. We will be moving on to the question portion, as we do have a group of student respondents who will be asking questions. And I will just call into the first student pair to join us now.
Hi everyone, I'm Ayushi and I use she, they pronouns. I would like to congratulate the panelists on their great presentations. Thank you for the insightful and important conversation that you initiated. And I'll have my fellow respondent Emily ask the question. Yeah.
Hi everybody, my name's Emily. My pronouns are she, her. Again, as Ayushi said, thank you for all of your presentations. They were really great. We wanted to ask Lydia your thoughts about, we have a question about sex positive movements. So a lot of sex positive movements, especially in the mainstream right now, are very focused on white, heterosexual, able-bodied sex. And we were wondering what your thoughts were on how we can work towards diversifying these movements and being more inclusive of disabled bodies and people in the LGBTQ plus community and people of color.
Thank you for the question, Emily. Yeah, I think historically when we've seen sex positive movements, it's tended to be very whitewashed. When we think of things like Free the Nipple, you can Google a picture and you will see all white women, all white majority cis women kind of dominating that narrative. And so I honestly think, and one of the things that we did in Decolonize and Deconstruct is talk about movements like this, right? We talked a bit about the fact that even being able to be a part of a movement like that that's focused on sex positivity, there's privilege in that, right? Like being able to march around topless to free the nipple and talk and focus specifically on sex and positivity is something that racialized women don't always get the ability to do, because there's constantly those kind of expectation of prioritizing racial issues at the same time, right? So I've noticed how women of color, Black women specifically, often have, one, been left out of those movements, but two, I don't think for me personally, it's always been prioritized in my work in regards to having those conversations about movements like that. But in regards to, outside of that specific example, in regards to body positivity more generally, I think that directly relates to kind of what I talked about in regards to the fact that sexual health, race, and disability are not these mutually exclusive, completely different identities that we'll never touch, right? When we think about Black people in regards to their sexual health, having the access, having the ability to even have representation of their bodies, right? People who are differently able, being able to have that representation of, this is what my body looks like. Because a lot of times when we think of sex positivity, again, it goes back to, okay, what kinds of people are we thinking of when we're thinking of sex, right? And I think this is kind of a long-winded way to say that when we think of sex itself, a lot of times it's rooted in white heteronormative ideas of bodies, of desire, of sex, of love, of people who are fully physically able to participate in all different kinds of things and don't have any kinds of physical disabilities. And so I think when we really get to the root of decolonizing the ways that we look at sex and the ways that we look at relationships and you know, our relationships to sex. I think that will really help for movements like that to be able to think about the kind of bodies that are included, right? If you're in a movement, a sex positive movement, and you see that there's nobody there that doesn't look like you, right? That might be something to question, right? So I think it's more about challenging what we already know about sex and sexuality, and challenging who has kind of been at the forefront of being represented in these kinds of movements, and how we can ensure that not so many people are being left behind.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both for your question, and Lydia for your answer. Next up, we have Nanaya and Jen.
Hi. My name is Jen, well, Janessa, but you can only call me Jen if that's easier. I want to say thank you to everyone for all of your presentations. I really enjoyed every single one of them, and they sparked a lot of questions in all of us. I tried to kind of incorporate some of the ideas that I had into this one question. I'm hoping it's not too much. This question is for Sarah. I know you talked a lot about mental illness with respect to media portrayal and archetypes, for example, the Harley Quinn character that you talked about a lot. I kind of wanted to ask your thoughts on how you think we as a society can progress towards deconstructing misconceptions about consent and stopping that over-sexualization of people with disabilities, specifically mental illnesses, but also while stopping the desexualization of disabled folks.
Thank you, Jen. That is a giant question. And the short answer is I don't fucking know. But the longer answer is, okay, I have some ideas too. And the cool thing about starting with those cultural beliefs or those the myths as the skeletons of stories is that we can work on them collectively. So I don't have to fucking know because it's not just me who's helping to write them. So we've seen some changes. So I mean, between when I was a university student, an undergraduate student, and now, and what I'm hearing you folks saying about just talking about consent at all is an extraordinary difference. And I've watched it change over the years. I've watched student submissions of essays begin just because of the subject areas I was teaching in. I watched them include their own stories of sexual assault in their essays and ask questions about, was this rape? Is this against the law? I had one student approach me after class once and say, well, you know, I was with this girl and blah, blah, blah. She was cheating on her boyfriend. She was a slut, blah, blah. But if what you're saying is right, I raped her. And I was like, yes. Sorry, I don't know what you wanted to hear, but yes, that's the law. And yes, that's what you did. And yes, now you have to deal with it. So some of the ways that we can and are deconstructing consent is just by the changes that that especially younger folks are making, sorry, younger than me folks, I guess, are making right now to how we talk about sex and sexual consent. How to stop over-sexualizing or pornifying people with mental illnesses on one hand, but not completely strip us of sexual agency on the other hand. a fine balance. It's sort of a tightrope walk, I guess. Some of the thoughts that spring to mind are first in reclaiming our stories. So once we start doing the curation and the editing ourselves, and for those of us who feel able to, just openly talking about our experiences, then necessarily those labels and those really tight boundaries have to open up, because reality just doesn't fit between them as they are. But then also that idea I mentioned with reconciling with ourselves, that we are more than our stories. So in some ways you can, or I can, reclaim my sexuality by going out and having some great sex. And it's not a story, it's just a thing that I do in my life that I get to experience, and that doesn't have to mean anything beyond my own pleasure to matter to me. So violence against women, sexual violence, gender-based violence, they are discursive problems. They're problems of stories and how we talk about and how we tell them. But they're also real. They also exist beyond the story. And the more we process and live in those experiences, the more we diversify those experiences, when and how we're able to, and the more different realities we force between those boundaries, the wider they're going to get.
Thank you. That was actually a very thoughtful answer that kind of, I was thinking too as well, like in terms of media representation, having like normalizing the idea of people who are disabled having sex and embracing their sexuality and things like that would also help. So thank you for that.
Okay, I apologize for my voice in advance. My name is Nana. I use she, they pronouns. And this question is actually for our last panelist. And I'd just like to applaud and thank you for the beautiful presentation. The question is, when discussing gender-based violence, we see that the access of healthcare and education may be challenging within the framing of many intersectional identities that may be oppressed. How might we be able to deconstruct and challenge systems to bring forth change, especially in expanding our knowledge of gender and the experiences of those outside the heteronormative mainstream? I know it's very long.
Thanks for that question, Lina. I'm trying to, can you repeat it? Is that okay? Or can you put it in the chat? Actually, can you put it in the chat? That would be very helpful for me.
Yes, I'll do that right now.
Okay. Yeah. I think broadly what I'm hearing in that question is like how we can make services more accessible to a wider range of people, in a way that's like respectful and affirming. And I think sort of, yeah, for me, I really see all gender services as a huge step in the right direction. I think when we start framing gender-based violence, thank you so much. When we start talking about gender-based violence as something that impacts all genders, it does start to change how we might approach dealing with it. And when I say, when I talk about that shift, I'm not at all trying to say that like on December 6th, for instance, which is coming up, we don't talk about women who are killed by partners, because that is something that deserves specific attention. I'm not saying that we should stop giving specific attention to different genders of folks. That's not at all what I'm trying to say. But I think if we can start talking about sexual violence and intimate partner violence and domestic violence as something that doesn't just happen to cis women, that's a huge step in the right direction, because then we start to undo this idea, or a little bit undo that idea of like what a normal body is, what a body that can actually be harmed is. And we just recognize that, you know, many men are impacted by sexual violence. Like the gay men that I support at work have a horrible time finding supports because they're not seen as like, it's not seen that it's even possible that they can be assaulted, right? And that just continues to be compounded if they're racialized, if they have a disability, right? And when so there's that. I think places like emergency rooms, places like sexual assault, domestic violence centers, so that's in my mouth, really need to, like, we need to continue to improve the understanding of the workers there around who goes in, like, and I know right now, definitely in downtown Toronto, people who are working in emergency rooms are exhausted, they're burnt out, and when that's happening, they treat people like garbage. And that is definitely happening right now and continues to happen, right? So there's so many things that need to be bolstered, because when we talk about something like gender-based violence, it's prevalent, it's everywhere. If there's that many people that have experienced it, it means that there's probably that many perpetrators. Like, it's a huge problem that needs broad-based attention from the world we live in, not just like advocates at rape crisis centers or, you know, people working in HIV. And I'm so excited, Lydia, that there's connections being made there in your work. So yeah, and then how can we expanding our knowledge of gender? I don't know. Yeah, I think rather than having supports going out and being like, oh, how do I learn about this, you know, new gender? How do I learn about this new identity? It's like, well, how do you start treating people like humans when you come in? Because you can't predict the diversity of people that are going to come into your center, right? So how do you start building in this idea that people are people? I'm sounding like a trite mug right now, but that people have, how do you humanize the survivors that come in to see you, right? And when I'm thinking of people with disabilities, thinking of people coming in and saying, I've been assaulted by a PSW, what can I do? And them not being dismissed, that being understood as gender-based violence, right? Someone coming in and be like, the doctor in the emergency room did this thing and said this thing about my body when I was in there getting an exam. That felt like harassment, that felt like assault. And instead of being like, oh no, that was a medical procedure, or oh no, that's actually an assault, right? Or, you know, gay men coming to our office and being like, there was literally nowhere I could go, they wouldn't call the same nurse for me. Well, what can I do, right? So understanding, getting over this assumption of who a true victim of sexual violence could be. Yeah. I don't know. It's not gonna happen tomorrow. It'd be nice if it did.
Thank you. Honestly, I know the question was very long, very
It's a great
detailed.
question. I love it. Yeah.
But overall, just a big thank you for the presentation, especially on the topics of like gender-based violence, as well as like how we may broaden and expand our knowledge on it. So thank you again.
Thank you so much to all of our amazing panelists and also all of our amazing student respondents for their prompt questions. I also want to give a huge thank you to Margot Francis and Michelle Mudge for organizing this amazing event. And also a thank you to my co-facilitator slash moderator, April. With that being said, we are ending just right on time. So I do want to thank everyone who joined to learn something today. And I hope everyone has a wonderful night. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Rabia.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Rabia, for the technical support and for facilitating facilitating such a great discussion.